will be presented today is sort of the backbone argument of my book project. I will essentially kind of give an overview of the research puzzle that motivated this project. I will also give a brief overview of the research design, the theoretical framework. I'm still doing some fieldwork on the topic. I will be doing more this summer, so much of this work is kind of work in progress, although sort of the main main design is there. And then I will just briefly talk about 2 empirical cases out of 4 that I examine in the book, and then give a discussion of the findings and implications. And so I'm interested in this China-Africa relations from sort of an IR perspective, which is kind of the background I come to this topic from. So essentially looking at foreign policy, looking at multilateral policy and relations between China and several African countries. Basically, what we hear and read a lot about when it comes to China-Africa relations has much to do with investments in infrastructure. So in this New York Times article, as many like it, whenever there's sort of a China-Africa story, either in the New York Times or in other sort of mainstream media, there's usually a focus on infrastructure projects, sort of portraying China as this power or new global power that has a lot of infrastructure projects that basically projects and exercises its power by showing it and manifesting it in infrastructure projects. And so we see that in this building of the new AU, the African Union headquarters. We see it in railways. We see it in different projects. My argument, right, in this project and my interest is to look at China-Africa relations in the sense of infrastructure, but in a different kind of infrastructure. And what I want to say and argue in the book and today's presentation is that China-Africa infrastructure relations are not just about the physical buildings and the railway and the material infrastructure we see, that there's a whole other set of infrastructure, which is more of an invisible type of infrastructure that is present and important in talking about China-Africa relations and talking about the power dynamics in the China-Africa relationship. This invisible or non-material type of infrastructure that I will be talking about has to do with professionalization trainings and capacity building programs that the Chinese government sponsors for Africans. So every year there are thousands of Africans from different walks of life, be they media specialists, agriculture specialists, civil servants, military experts who get invited to be part of these professionalization training programs and invited to China for trainings, for capacity building programs. And in a lot of ways, we do hear and read a lot about China's involvement in the continent from the perspective of this kind of visible and material infrastructure. So we know about CCTV's big studio productions in Nairobi. We know about Xinhua. We know about 2 different media programs. We know about different stadiums and different projects, but we don't hear or read or know a lot about this other type of infrastructure that's being built, which is really based on this people-to-people. It's based on this kind of connection and network through these capacity building programs and through these professionalization training programs. And that is sort of the essence of what I want to look at. That's what I want to investigate. That's what I want to study, and that's what I want to sort of theorize back as just to looking at the what makes China powerful in Africa beyond what meets the eye, right? Beyond what meets the material infrastructure that we see. With this being said, the questions then that I ask throughout is just how do we make sense of these investments in human resource development? So whenever there's an investment that's made in a project, say in a factory or a firm, it's easier to sort of do an analysis of the return of investments. However, when we are talking about investments in human development resources, it's very difficult to actually measure to what extent actually is China getting back the money that it's putting in all of these trainings. And here we're talking about thousands of these trainings being administered and sponsored every year. And the numbers are only growing. Numbers of both in terms of sort of, like I said, the media experts or the African students or military experts who get invited to be part of these capacity building programs. The numbers are only increasing. And so the question is, how do we make sense of them? Right? So if we're talking about other investments, it's much easier to sort of do a calculation of what is the return on investment, is it working, is it not working. However, when it comes to invisible sort of this human resource development, then the question is, how do you make sense of that, right? So what's the impact of these investments and these capacity building programs on African governance, right? When we look at these numbers, right? So what do these investments also tell us about the power dynamics? Again, so that's sort of my IR background there. So looking at the power dynamics and what these investments add to the story that we know about China and Africa. And so I essentially problematize basically the unidirectionality of these capacity building programs. At front value, these trainings go from sort of Chinese-sponsored trainers to African recipient trainees, right? There's hardly ever the other way around, right? So these are very unidirectional, I'm going to talk a little bit about the discourse in which these capacity building programs are couched. And the discourse is about South-South relations, it's about solidarity, it's about mutual respect and equal relations, and that kind of rhetoric that kind of associates China to sort of this equal partner, right, type of power. But then again, we ask the question, on practice, does that translate, right? What does it translate to and how do we see it? And so I also want to look at what all goes on in these expert capacity building programs, right? So what are Africans learning? How is that changing the way they think about things? Is it changing the way that they think about development, for example? Is it changing the way they think about agriculture or about media and journalism or about peacekeeping and peace building, right? Are we learning things that are different from the usual, right? The sort of the status quo, the Washington consensus, the Western perspective, whatever you want to call it. Is there such a thing as a China model, and how do we know what it is? And are these capacity building programs a tool to diffuse norms and values and knowledge about China's model? And so these are the questions that I'm interested in. So really 2 seconds spent on this just because, but in a lot of ways, the literature that I talk to is much of an IR literature that talks about soft power, that talks about power of attraction, that talks about sort of how do we kind of think about power from a non-coercive, non-material kind of perspective. So Joseph Nye's soft power kind of comes to mind when we're analyzing sort of these different diplomatic relations that do not necessarily involve coercive behavior. So I look at a lot of that literature, but I'm happy to come back to this in the Q&A if we want to address it. But this is kind of sort of really quick background to that. So I do a lot of essentially 2-step analysis. And so I rely a lot on official discourses that come from the FOCAC, which is the Forum of China-Africa Relations. And this summit sort of happens every 3 years, which kind of connects or reunites or unites Chinese and African leadership, after which there's an action plan, right? The action plan usually gives directives as to what's going to happen in terms of policy for the next 3 years. I look at those action plans just to have a sense of the numbers, what's been committed in terms of funding for these capacity building programs. What are the numbers? What are the trends? Are they increasing, decreasing? What kind of types of capacity building programs are given and to whom? But also what's really interesting to me is to look at sort of the discourse. How are they presented? So when we're talking about, to me, when we're talking about kind of this South-South solidarity connection, right, between China, which is a global South state that kind of sees itself as a country that has a lot of similarities in terms of experience with African countries in fighting colonialism and going through development and doing a lot of sort of these steps. And so there's this focus in the discourse on global South-South mutual sort of equal relations, but at the same time, like I said, these capacity building programs are very much unidirectional. Right? They are not mutual, they're not win-win, they're not reciprocal, they are basically very unidirectional. So there is sort of a discrepancy there. There's a disconnect there. So in a certain sense, that's kind of really what's we're puzzling about this. And so I both look at the discourse in which these capacity building programs are framed, but also African leader speeches that talk about these capacity building programs. And of course, I've done a lot of interviews with a lot of kind of civil servants, diplomats, foreign affairs ministry officials, and participants in these capacity building programs to sort of gauge what they are saying about these programs themselves. So I talked to a whole host of different people, both on the organizing side, on the participating side, and a lot in Addis Ababa because it's home to the African Union headquarters. It's easy access to a lot of people, but also in Kenya and in China. So again, I sort of do this two-step where I look at the official discourse and I compare that or contrast it to the on-ground trainings. So the cases that I looked at in terms of professionalization trainings are so Chinese-sponsored trainings for security experts and military. So these include peacekeeping officers, it includes private security, it includes high-ranking military officers from different African countries that are invited sometimes on a regular basis to China to participate in these professionalization trainings. So that's one case. The other case was journalists and media experts, which a lot of times these journalists are, sometimes it's just they are kind of like PR staff for different ministries in different African governments. Sometimes these are students of communication and journalism. There's just different types of media experts who also get invited to go to China to participate in capacity building programs. A lot of these programs are short-term, so they can range from 2 weeks to 6 weeks, or some of them are long-term. They can go up for a year and more. So in a lot of cases, if the case of the media experts, sometimes you see them on the ground for 12 months at a time, for example. And so those are kind of, that's the second case. The third case is the agriculture experts. Maybe you have, through the seminar, or maybe you've encountered in other readings, the demonstration centers, the agriculture demonstration centers, which are these projects that the Chinese government sponsors in different African countries, where you see that there's a piece of land that gets leased, and then there's a lot of experimentation that goes on. There's also the demonstration centers, which are built on this leased land. So we talk a lot about those demonstration centers, but we don't talk enough about the capacity building programs that goes on in those demonstration centers. So these are lessons and trainings and workshops that involve Chinese agriculture experts to train their African counterparts in different technologies or different skills, technical skills. Some of these trainings are also, they also do the reverse, where they invite Chinese or African agriculture experts to China to participate in workshops. So I got the chance to talk to a lot of participants in these trainings, and just to get the sense of what they think about the programs. Are they useful? Are they learning anything? Are they positive? What do they learn? And then the last kind of case, or the fourth case, is the training programs that happen through Confucius Institutes. And then there's an increasing number of Confucius Institutes that are kind of set up and established in different African countries. And there's a lot of capacity building programs that get involved or are involved in these Confucius Institutes. And so I suppose for today, I'm just going to focus on the first two, but I'm more than happy to address any of the others in the Q&A. But there's one thing that's kind of really interesting that's common to all of these cases is that in a lot of ways, these trips and these invitations for capacity building programs to China, they all have a component to them that that is essentially a tour of China, sort of this cultural aspect to them that invites all these participants to go around to different provinces in China. Oftentimes, it's kind of a preset itinerary where they start somewhere, they go to the next one, and the next one, the next one, and everybody does the same thing, and it's pretty much copy-paste all over. And in a lot of ways, these cultural trips are really important because they sort of have the goal of taking these leaders, government officials and high-ranking military officials and students and every participant of these trainings to sort of go see rural areas in China, to sort of establish that similarity between rural areas in China and rural areas in different African countries, but also taking them to ultra modern and very developed parts of China to sort of establish that this is where we came from. This is where we began, this is where we are, and to sort of create that idea that you too can do this, you too can move from this to that, from this point to that point. So it's a way to showcase China's development story to all of these participants in these capacity building programs. You get to see some very rural areas which are kind of similar, and they strike this kind of we're alike type of sentiment, but you also get to see the super hyper ultra modern kind of parts and cities of China, which highlights the successful story of China's development model. So there's this component that's really interesting and important about all these capacity building programs. And I say it is important because in a lot of ways, in fact, and I'll take just a small tangent here, but I had the experience of interviewing people who were part of an agriculture capacity building program, and the one delegate from Rwanda that I had the chance to interview was basically just spent like 15 minutes telling me how the capacity building program was basically useless to him because all the skills and the tips and everything that was shared kind of applied to big farm, large scale land. Where he was coming from did not have that. And then it did not apply to the context in which he was going to go back and supposedly take that knowledge and apply it. So we spent a lot of time sort of going through and just talking about the disadvantages of what was happening in the program. But still, when I asked him overall what he thought about the capacity building program as an experience, he recommended it and he thought it was positive and he was very happy with it. But basically mentioning this idea that, oh, it's a chance to actually see China's kind of success story. It's a chance to see what the Chinese government is able to do and why how we're not able to do the same thing, right? So there's this element to these capacity building programs, which is this cultural aspect that's really important. Even when the content fails, the experience is still positive, right? So that's kind of interesting about that. So now in kind of going a little bit over this first case, I kind of want to show how different, what are the differences? So what is it that these trainings do differently? And then just try to understand, again, the question of the impact. So when you have more and more African military experts and security experts being trained in China, what do we expect to see different? Is there anything different that we expect to see from that? Okay, I guess right here. Maybe? All right. So, like I said, in this case, I looked at trainings for high-ranking military officers, for private security companies, and for peacekeeping troops. I'll talk a bit about peacekeeping troops. Also because I'm super interested in this, I'm doing a project this summer about this particularly. So I've been really kind of reading a lot about it and being interested in it. And so overall, as you may already know, when China participates or China contributes more peacekeeping troops than all the UN Security Council permanent members together, put together, right? So more than the US, France, UK, Russia together. So China has contributes more than all of the rest put together. Not more than Pakistan or more than Bangladesh, but we're talking about United Nations Security Council permanent members. On the map here, you can see the current deployment of Chinese troops here in blue, just to give you an idea, where they are. So at any given moment, when you talk about conflict zones in Africa where there are peacekeeping troops, you'll see way more Chinese peacekeeping troops than you can see any of the others, right? So, and China has kind of been proactive about being more involved in peacekeeping, not just by contributing numbers of troops, but also by recently in 2016, the Chinese Ministry of Defense started an initiative to train peacekeeping troops and peacekeepers from Africa. So the first group was just 17, a group of 17, a delegation of 17 peacekeeping officers who went to China for training. But the goal is to train about 2,000 more over the next 4 years. And of course, the numbers are expected to grow in that sense. So that kind of aspect of training is what's interesting to me. As we know, or we may know, China has, for the most part, sends non-combat troops to be part of peacekeeping missions. Right? So it sends mostly doctors, engineers, civilians, basically. Very recently, it started sending battalions, and that's basically South Sudan and to Mali. But the vast majority of Chinese peacekeeping troops are non-combat troops. What they do, they are tasked to pave roads, thousands and hundreds of thousands of kilometers of roads. They treat hundreds of thousands of patients. They work on development projects, on getting drinking water, on working on sort of different local development communities. They build schools, they build bridges. This is what Chinese sort of peacekeeping troops are mandated to do. And so, like I said, at any given moment, when you look at different conflicts that involve peacekeeping troops, this is what you would see the Chinese troops doing. Like we see here in this small testimony by Malian, I'm sorry, former Prime Minister of Mali. The idea is that there's a connection here, right, between peace, security, and development that comes up every time we see testimonies about Chinese peacekeeping troops and what they do for local populations. I suppose in this, oh, I'm sorry, went too far, right here. In this picture, this is like a school that was built in the Congo to sort of teach, built by Chinese peacekeeping troops. And they also volunteer teach Mandarin in it. And so this is sort of a school for orphans, right? So that's just an example. And so when I look at this peacekeeping, right, when I look at it and peace building, there is something a little bit different about the ways that Chinese government views peacekeeping and peace building, which is to say it is completely related and connected to development, right? Not as opposed to sort of the liberal peace approach to peace building and peacekeeping that sort of could be talked about as the Western approach, which is really connected to good governance. So there's these issues about good governance, like fighting corruption or helping civil society or getting NGOs, or so that sort of work is completely out of the agenda when we're talking about what constitutes peace from a Chinese perspective. And this developmentalist peace approach is what it's called. And so the way that peace is conceptualized in this sense is completely connected to development. It has nothing to do with good governance. There's no mention of that. There's no focus on that. And so that is kind of a different way. That's a sort of a way in which you could see sort of the Chinese model manifest itself in this way. where we're not talking about China reinventing the wheel and trying to create some new international institution to, it's actually really just reinterpreting parts of it. So you still do, you're training peacekeepers, right, that are going to be part of something that's already there, but you're doing it in a different way, right? And so that sort of focus on development, much less on good governance and more on actual kind of practical development issues as part and parcel of sort of China's developmental peace approach, right? So that was in a certain sense, and like I said, I'll be doing more work this summer on this question of trainings, doing more field work and more interviews to sort of just get a better grasp of exactly the differences and how it's working and all of that. But it's definitely, to the point here is definitely to sort of show at the very base sort of this difference in the model, right, in the priorities put by Chinese trainings for African peacekeepers. Now, really briefly, because I know we're kind of running out of time, but very briefly, I'll just really quickly talk about the other case, the second case, which is about media trainings. And so these trainings are, like I said, short, long-term trainings. They include students or include people who work for governments as PR or communication liaisons for different governments. When you look at the discourse in a lot of ways, the trainings for media are portrayed as a way to sort of counterbalance the Western narrative on China-Africa, which in the Chinese kind of argument, Western narrative of China-Africa tends to be very negative and tends to paint China's activities and investments in Africa with sort of a negative brush. And the idea here is that by bringing all of these African journalists to China, they get to experience China firsthand, they get to understand China, they get to know a bit more about its culture, its history, and then they get to be more fair in reporting back on China-Africa rather than copying, what would Western kind of mainstream media say about a given event. So that's kind of the argument that's presented there. So this idea that it needs to be reclaiming space in the sense of media space, right? What's kind of really interesting about the presence of a lot of African media experts is that I've encountered a lot of people I've done interviews with who had been invited to be part of these media trainings, but they finished their training, they went home, and then they came back to China on their own money to pursue a degree at universities for journalism degrees. So there's a lot of returnees, which was really interesting. And there's more and more of these who actually are so impressed and attracted that they actually would go back and pay out of their own pocket to study in China. And this is really interesting because just about 2 weeks ago, there was a report that showed that China has become the largest destination for Anglophone African students. By far, China is getting more students than the UK, than Germany, than different European countries or the US. So it has become the #1 destination for African students, right? So it's really interesting, and to me it was really interesting also because when you think about press, when you think about media, when you think about journalism, I mean, China does not really come like as the kind of the first place that comes to mind for that, right? Not at all. In fact, yes, in fact, when I check the World Press Freedom Index, I mean, China ranks 176 over 180. Ghana ranks 26. South Africa ranks 38. Kenya ranks 90 something, I believe it's 96. So even then, like, it's much better. So you wonder, what is it that's so attractive and so that these African trainees are sort of being attracted to China and going to universities to study there. So I went and did a bit of a curriculum analysis just because I was curious, right? I wanted to know what goes into these trainings. And so I have a former Gator, former UF person who works, this is the power of connections, that works in the China-Africa, the CUC, which is Chinese Communication University of China in Beijing. And there's a whole program that the university has that just trains African media experts. This is what they do. And so I got in touch with her, got really lucky that I was given access to the curriculum, also given access to a list of participants whom I interviewed and talked to and did lots of observation groups and participant observation work with them. In the curriculum analysis, like there were a few things that I perhaps would like to flag out is when there's a unit on sort of the China-Taiwan history relation, right? So there was something there that kind of there was a unit also on kind of government media relations, right? So how there needs to be sort of a constructive approach, not confrontational approach to journalism, where instead of pointing out criticism and pointing out problems with the government, you don't butt heads with the government. You sort of there's this approach that's kind of constructive journalism approach. So these were some of the differences, or some of the things that you would pay attention to as a sort of being maybe ideologically different from what you would expect if you were to get a degree in Ghana on journalism. You probably wouldn't have necessarily a unit on how to please the government, for example, or how to be friends with the government or something, right? So those were some of the differences, right? But it's really kind of really overall, it's interesting to see maybe like do a longitudinal study on like how perhaps the ways that these journalists kind of report in China, Africa, that changes over time or something, which is not something that I was able to do because a lot of this work was done about a summer ago. And these trainings are happening as we're talking. This isn't something that happened 10 years ago, or I can benefit from that distance to see. But it is definitely something that sort of is interesting to pursue, interesting to look at. But overall, what sort of I get from, because I need to close here, from the different cases, the empirical cases that I examined, is this kind of this focus on the network, on expanding network, and this network includes both sort of high-ranking military officials. There's the study that shows that there is at least one high-ranking military officer from every African country that was trained in China. And so, whereas we don't necessarily know what exactly, like I said, what exactly is the return of such investment, we know that it's connections. We know that it's expanding a network. We know that it's expanding this sort of this people-to-people kind of connection, right? So as we can't know that, I don't know, like, oh, because you train 5 people, you have a military base. We can't really establish that. But we can establish certainly that by examining China-Africa relations just from the sort of material, visible infrastructure that we can see and count and visibly kind of assess, we're not able to actually get the full picture of what's happening in the China-Africa relations. But there is an entire kind of sort of infrastructure that is built through these capacity building programs, that is built through sort of diffusing China's model, diffusing China's development success story, through these trips, through these capacity building programs, that in turn, and especially when it gets to the Confucius Institute, you get the idea about the network, the power of networking. That's really kind of important there. And so I suppose to close, like I said, my whole kind of like spiel with this is that it's not enough to sort of just focus on investments in visible material infrastructure, but it's really important to also look at these people-to-people, these capacity building programs, to problematize them, to understand what is kind of the impact of these investments in human resource development on African governance, on the different sort of models, and to see, sort of understand power dynamics from that perspective. So with this, I will turn it to the audience for Q&A.